Well, good evening, and welcome if you're joining with us live. This also has the opportunity where you might be watching later as far as taped. One of the things that I want to encourage if you are watching either online or taped is to get the notes that we've attached. And they're both attached to the Facebook, and they will be attached as well if you're watching later on the church's website. So, good to see you all here who are able to be here live. This is, for me, much more enjoyable than just staring at an iPad screen. Though I am equally thankful that there are people who are able to join with us and be part of this virtually as well. Let me open us with prayer, and then I will tell you what I want to do for us. Dear Lord, thank you for tonight, and ask that you would bless this evening. Thank you for the gift that you give us. And while it is easy for us to take it for granted, Lord, we are given reminders of just how precious it is to have the freedom to be able to gather in your name together, to learn, to grow. This hasn't always been the experience for your church, but we give thanks that we can do that this evening. As we turn towards understanding some of the challenges that are presented from our culture tonight, and the way that some of the real values that are shaping our society end up having a place of really being in opposition to your teachings, and specifically around how we conduct ourselves as sexual beings. I pray that you would bless our learning, our growing, our understanding, that we might be better witnesses of you. So pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So tonight's question is, isn't Christianity homophobic and transphobic? And this is a big question, and it is one that gets a lot of it's getting asked a lot more. It's getting a lot more accusations. It has a lot of heat behind it. And let me share a little bit. This has been, the issue of homosexuality has been something that's been part of my life since the 1990s, as far as just kind of grappling within the church and what is the Christian response to this. And, Westside is part of the Presbyterian tradition, and when the question really started getting asked, it was back basically in the early 1970s, where the question was, is our understanding of homosexuality and the Bible's teaching on homosexuality really accurate? And it's coming out of where we were culturally, and the movement towards homosexuals is beginning to advocate for their rights. And I have to tell you that, as it began, it was a valid question. We can look at some of the ways that the church has approached who we are as sexual beings, and it hasn't always been the best reading of Scripture. And in the Presbyterian Church, what we're famous for is making task force and committees and stuff, and that's exactly what we did. And we're also, on kind of the heady side of things, we will read lots of books and write lots of papers and do all that sort of stuff. And so they came out with a fairly substantial report that got presented at General Assembly, and it began to be some of the heat that led to just this ongoing movement for more than 25 years of debating and bickering, which then I came into in the 1990s. Now, out of this, I can, and we can have some discussion about this. I can walk you through all the biblical texts that deal with homosexuality. I can deal with all the word studies. I can deal with a lot of the different arguments that people have made to try to make it be biblical. And there's going to be value for this. But this part's been going on for 30, 40 years. And so I approached this question, and there were two parts to it that stood out to me. One part is that transgenderism is definitely more recent. with it was 2015 when Bruce Jenner came out and identified as Caitlyn Jenner, and at that point, that's really when we started to have more of the transgender issue come to the forefront. But with both of these, one of the things that began to emerge is that you had this new language of homophobic and transphobic. And that's not the way that we used to talk about it. We used to just talk about homosexual and you must be against homosexuals. And then we had this language of homophobic and transphobic. And that part of what drew me to this question and say, oh, I'll take this one, was that issue of how it's getting framed today. Because it's getting framed on purpose. It's not, are you against homosexuality? It's, are you homophobic? And a phobia represents an irrational fear. And if it's an irrational fear, then there's no rationality behind it. You have some sort of neurosis, some problems with you. And so, how do we get here? How do we get to this place that when we talk about sexual matters like homosexuality or transgenderism, our society will immediately jump to the idea that you must be phobic about it if you don't agree with the position that it should just be readily accepted. And so, here's what I want to offer you. And I hope you enjoy this because it's the only thing I have planned for, but we'll see how it goes. I have this week and I have next week, and then Bill finishes out the class. And what I want to do, I can't do in a week. And so I like to tackle this question over 2 weeks. And today, I'm mostly going to talk, but I want to get your guys' input and reactions as we go. And so I won't break you up into small groups this week, but we are going to have some discussion, so hopefully you don't get bored of listening to me. With that, let me give you a little bit of an outline of where we're going to try to go. Where are we and how did we get here? And in particular, what I'm going to try to do for you is share with you some of the things of what I see, what I understand, books that I've read, things that I'm learning, just kind of really examining where we are presently in our culture to get to this place where the immediate assumption is that if you don't agree with accepting homosexuality and transgenderism, then you must be homophobic or transphobic. One of the books that I read that really inspired me to take this dialogue in this direction was The Triumph of the Modern Self. And the author of this story is Presbyterian. He teaches out of Grove College, out of Pennsylvania. And he shares a story that for me just kind of gives you kind of a picture of just realizing, yeah, something's happened here. And his story that he shares is that 9 years ago my grandfather died. And 9 years ago, if you would have went to my grandfather and said, I'm a man stuck in a woman's body, or I'm a woman stuck in a man's body, he says my grandfather wouldn't have understood anything that you were saying. It would have made no sense to him whatsoever. He just would not have grasped it. And the author's observation is now, 9 years later, if you don't just accept that as being absolutely just valid, you're on the wrong side of history, and there's something wrong with you.
Something wrong with me, I guess.
Yeah, something wrong with me, I guess. How did we get there? I mean, and this is the part where as Christians, our beliefs fly counter to these claims, and we're just sitting there going, and there is an anti-Christian aspect to all of this stuff when it comes to the teachings around human sexuality. So, to understand this, we've got to do some historical work. And this means going back into the 1800s and the 1900s and some of the early 1700s. And what I'm going to try to do for you today is do some of this work where some of these names will probably be familiar to you. You may have studied them. That'd be wonderful. You may have never studied them. You have the notes here. I don't want you to get overwhelmed by the names. There's a story to be told, and I'm going to try to tell the story for you, and how this all holds together.
Well, this is maybe irrelevant, but sometimes we spend half our time trying to find what page you're on.
Yes.
So you could bring us up to speed, that would help.
Wonderful. And the nice thing is the pages are numbered.
Yes, but yet you have to mention.
Yes.
They're bigger than
We're gonna go through this pretty linearly, but I will, and if I don't tell you, if you get lost, tell me. And that's part of why I'm saying it's gonna take 2 weeks, because I already spent an hour this morning with the 9 o'clock Bible study, and there was no possible way that I could even get through half the material. So we'll see how this goes. But I've worked on this a little bit more. Where are we? How did we get there? Understanding the roots of the revolution. There is a couple of different revolutions to talk about. And this becomes the part where I think most of us in America are familiar with the fact that in the 1960s, we had a sexual revolution. But there is a deeper, more fundamental revolution of a shift. It is a shift of moving away from God and moving towards man as the center of all things. And so this becomes a big part of the story. One of the things to know about homosexuality and transgenderism is they are all an outwork of the sexual revolution. But the sexual revolution didn't cause the sexual revolution. There were other factors that were going at play that brought about the sexual revolution. And part of my goal is that as we understand this story about the forces at work in our society, it will make us better listeners, a clear sense of what's going on. We won't have to come in with heat. I'm assuming that in a lot of these ways, there's a whole bunch of people who have got caught up in this stuff. They have no idea the intellectual roots of it. We don't even think about it. That's one of the things with worldview. Worldview, you just assume this is how things are, and you don't realize that you're looking with a pair of glasses and it's shaping everything. So for today, this is what we're going to try to accomplish. Where are we and how did we get here? And that's it. The other stuff will be next week. Where are we? And I'm starting with trying to just give a picture of where we are, of just some of the ideas, some of the big things that this is our culture, this is the world that we live in. And I want to give you a picture in words. I'm going to explain what these words mean. And I want you to be thinking about it and go, is this description accurate? And this is a place for dialogue. But, I hope it is. I'm trying to do something, but I'm trying to give the big ideas that this is what's going on in our society. The first one probably should be non-controversial. One of the big things that shape our world today is individualism. And this is the part of some of the uniqueness. It's part of it's a huge part of our American identity, but it is a part of Western civilization. It is one of the things that distinguishes Western civilization and where we've come at this point as moderns from pretty much every other culture that's ever existed. For example, when you read the New Testament, one of the things to always kind of have in your background is that they never started with the individual, they always started with a group, a community, a people. And they thought of we, and then you move from the we to the I. So much of the instruction in the New Testament is y'all. And we individualize it all, and we think about it just in personal terms. And in fact, it's much more about communal terms, about how you all get along together.
Ralph,
yes.
I may have mentioned this before in the hearing of everybody, I don't know, but we have Spanish Bibles as well as English in our house, and it's always interesting to me to see where the Spanish has ustedes, the plural for you, which is so distinct from the singular, obviously in Spanish, where in English they look the same, you or you.
Yep.
And boy, does that help.
Comment for people online is, this is one of the things where even our language doesn't help us as far as interpretation. Because when we say you, it could be you singular or you plural, and there's no way to know except for context. So we read you and we hear it, and our culture causes us to immediately think, oh, it's telling me what I need to do. Everybody else before us, they would be hearing that, and if their language didn't have that, which almost all of them do, they would have immediately said, this is what we need to be working on. And that's just that difference. We're highly individualistic. Another part of our culture is that we're materialistic. And we think that the material is the most real thing. Now, there's a little bit in our culture where, as Christians, we have this fundamental belief. We are embodied spiritual beings. Yes, we are physical, but there is spiritual reality, and we think that God is spirit, and he's the most true being in the world, and so we know that there are spiritual realities. Our world, and even American culture in particular, out of what you would say is of European countries, we have not let go of the idea of spirit. We have lots of people who identify as some way spiritual, even if they reject organized religion and Christianity altogether. But by and large, we more focus on material things. We want material things. We are consumers. Material things have a big part of our lives. We don't think in spiritual terms very well or very often. Next big word, hedonistic, which is hedonism. We pursue happiness. And again, from America, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's a big thing. But the way that we would talk about it is, and hedonism kind of has a little bit of an overtone of a negative thing. And, if your only pursuit is comfort or personal pleasure, well, it's there, you were made for more than that. That would probably lead you astray. But that's what our culture aims for. Nothing wrong with happiness, nothing wrong with pleasure, nothing wrong with comfort. But one of the questions become, is that the purpose of humanity? Okay, so the next one on my list of just painting a picture of some of the major things that shape us. Now, and I want you to be thinking, as I say that we are a materialistic culture, does that resonate? Does anybody want to say that, no, that's really not true, we're much more spiritual than materialistic in Western civilization? I'm getting a shaking of heads. The hedonistic part, that we're a people who are pursuing pleasure and comfort and personal happiness. Okay? Sexually obsessed. So this is getting close to what our subject is. One of the things that's going on with the LGBTQ plus movement is that they're making sexual identity primary about how we understand ourselves as human beings. Now, I've never had the tendency to go around and primarily identify myself by my sex. I'm heterosexual. And when we mean sex there, we're not just talking about gender, and then we can get into a discussion about gender, but we're really talking about how I function as a sexual being and the type of sex that, that I try to, I'm married, so which I engage in. Now, but our society is moving in that way, and it does identify that way, and it's made identifying that way a big thing. And then the other part of this is sexually obsessed. Sex is everywhere. Sex sells everything. We use sex to sell cheeseburgers. Hugh Hefner in 2005 was the celebrity spokesperson for Carl's Jr.'s new $6 cheeseburger. It's just ubiquitous. Now, there's been a place as far as sex throughout human history, but never like in our culture, ever.
Today we filled out a form and it wanted to know what our sex was, but when we were born, what was our sex? I've never had that before.
Oh yeah, so there was a comment, and we're going to lead into this about how have we gotten to this place. And this is a big part of what we're going to try to understand today, which is that now even our government has been influenced by transgenderism, where now what we're thinking about is something along the lines of, well, what was your assigned gender? And the old way was, well, you were born with either male parts or female parts, and so that told us that you are a boy or a girl, and that's what happened. And but now what our society is saying is just because I was born that way doesn't mean that's who I really am. And if you struggle to understand that, that's what I'm hoping hopefully by the end of today, you'll at least begin to kind of go, what are the roots of why this is going? Because I'm going to keep talking in that direction.
Excuse me.
Lowell.
Just a question. I agree, our society is sexually obsessed, but I'm not so sure we're more sexually obsessed than some other cultures. When I look at, some of the pagan cultures, some of the Roman cultures, as I look at homosexuality throughout the world, but we do have more availability. Am I right or wrong on that?
Well, so there's a question of is if we go back historically and we look at pagan culture, there was a lot of sex stuff going on, and we find homosexuality, and all of that is true. But none of those societies put what you did sexually at the center of who you are, or that's most important. And they didn't, and we live in this new age, which is part of the materialistic part of this consumer age, where you and I have some things that, this is some of the uniqueness of our culture. You and I have to make more decisions every day than anybody else who's ever gone before us, because we have all of this information coming at us because we are these consumers, and so there's always these choices that we have to make. We have 50 different types of toothpaste. And the thing is that there's people who want to make a profit. And so now when you think about making profits, you think about advertising, and when you think about advertising, you use sex. And none of that ever occurred. This is the part where you go down the street and you will find scantily clad women. All the ancient cultures, women, if you really cared about women, they would be under veils because you were trying to protect them. And so in it, there is just, and then, until the advent of modern technology to limit the ability for you to get pregnant as a woman, there were always the precautionary problems of what would happen about sex, where now, it's different. Pornography, huge. I still think it's probably the biggest profiting thing on the internet. So all of this stuff is like, yeah, you can go back and sex has always been a thing. But, and when we get to this is the part where, the name that you're going to associate with getting us there is going to be Freud. And I'll tell you why. Why did I turn that over? I'm not quite done yet. Okay. There we go. And then progressive. Now, I was sharing this morning. One of the authors put iconoclastic, and this is the negative way to put it. One of the things that our culture is doing is it's trying to progress in a future, and in many ways it's trying to cut itself off from the past. And now out of this, there's a positive sense. There is, and we can go back in American history and we can talk manifest destiny, and we're moving in a certain direction and things are getting better and we want to work towards progress. And these things, are part of our story. It's part of the optimism that came out of the Enlightenment. But in that revolutionary progressive spirit, that the American Revolution brought forth a republic that was defined by a set of laws that has become a beacon of light for the world about freedom. There was another revolution that occurred in Western civilization pretty much at the very same time, about a decade after us, and it was the French Revolution, and it had the same idea of progress, and it had a lot of the same ideas and goals of what it was trying to do, but it devolved into chaos and anarchy and death, and and so this is the part where progress can be a positive, but there becomes a way in which progress where you basically want to destroy your past and get rid of it so that you can build a better future. And some of those elements are present. There's positive, there's negative, but there is this sense that we want to be on the side of progress. People agree with that? Okay. Now, any questions, thoughts over the words that we covered?
Well, just I would add to, we want to be on the side of progress. I think it goes along with that, the idea mankind is progressing, is able and can and should be.
So let me tell you quickly the story behind that. One of the people who basically gave a picture of this is Hegel. Not very many people read Hegel, and Hegel's kind of confusing to read. I had to read him, and it was not the most enjoyable thing in the world. But with Hegel, what he is basically doing is setting up that there is a spirit. He wasn't a materialist, he was a spiritualist. And this spirit is moving the world towards progress. And as we move forward, we keep progressing. And he called it this dialectic. And so you have, this phase of history, and you have the next phase of history. And there's a little bit of battle as you move from one sort of worldview to a next sort of a worldview, but every worldview kind of takes some of the pieces of before and gets better. That's that idea of progress, which has influenced us, begins with Hegel. Though we could sit there and we could say that really the idea of progress begins with Christianity, because what you get there is that history has a goal, and it's making progress towards the purposes for which God created it. And in that, we go, yes, indeed, there is direction. Things, and this is the part of us for Christian hope. We are not without hope. We believe that no matter what we see in the world right now, we have a bright future before us. And that's the gift of God. Okay, now we're on page 2.
Ralph?
Yeah.
It seems like also, where are we that's significant in today's society and culture? Is a growing belief that there is a lack of a absolute moral standard or truth.
Yes. And the comment is that there is, along with this, that basically there's an affirmation of moral relativism. And yes, indeed, that is part and parcel to this. And I probably could have named it in that section. It is an underlying root cause of what I'm trying to do. I gave you a bunch of words that in some way are trying to give a picture. Now let me give you a name to the frame of those words that philosophers use to try to explain kind of our culture. Does this make sense to you? Now you have the picture. What do we call it? We've got all of these forces at work within our culture. What's going on? And one of the names that captures this, and I think it's probably the best name out there, is Expressive Individualism. And Expressive Individualism is a way of talking about the way that you and I interact in the world, because the world that we inhabit, the culture, shapes us towards this. This comes from Charles Taylor, one of the more significant philosophers of the last 15, 20 years, especially when it comes to the analysis of culture. This is his book called A Secular Age. It's a pretty thick read. I haven't finished it yet, but it's quite analytical, but it's quite good. Each of us has his or her own way of realizing our humanity, and that it is important to find out and to live out one's own understanding of humanity, as against surrendering to conformity with a model imposed on us that should be from outside of society, or the previous generation, or religious or political authority. What I'm going to tell you the story of is that we are in a place in society where the overall sense of it is that who you really are is buried inside of you, and you need to discover it. And you're unique, you're special, but to be true to yourself, you got to discover who you are, and that's from within, and don't allow the outside world to force you into a mold, because that will be oppressive, that will be evil to you. Positively, you can be anything that you want to be. All you have to do is just be true to yourself and become what you really are, and you can be whatever you want to be. But you discovering it, it's the answer of you. Do you hear that in our society?
Yeah.
That's called expressive individualism. That's the part where, in some way, you and I are influenced by this. We may not be complete expressive individualists, but we get caught up into it, and everybody does, because these forces are at work in our culture. Clay.
I've got a lot of background with this. My first marriage, anyways. After experiencing it with her, that we lasted about 9 months, but it was a point of being loved and feeling accepted that really caused her to go that direction. And she was a basketball player, and she loved being with that group. And she didn't ever think that she felt that way until she had her environment directed for her. And her mom picking her friends and so on and so forth. So when you say expressive individualism, that's the way she did it, was to seek who loved her more than I loved her, and then follow in the same step. Whether she was born with it or not, I don't believe so.
This becomes we'll come back to that probably next week as far as the born with stuff, because we've progressed a little bit in our understanding as far as even the mission of homosexuals in the midst of kind of talking about how are you born. What expressive individualism says is it makes me the biggest thing in my life. I've got to worry about me more than anything else, and I've got to become and make myself happy. And if I get married with somebody else, and their happiness and my happiness, but that might not work out, so I'll just keep going. Now, I'll be more quickly with this next one, because I'm just kind of trying to name for you where we are. Yes.
It seems to me that statement supports anarchy. No religious or political authority. I can do what I want. I can speed, I can go 80 miles an hour and knock people off the road. And that's not supposed to be wrong.
It seems to be that the expressive individualism supports anarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does.
And
some of this.
We've been telling kids, you can be whatever you want. So some guy goes and decides he's going to go murder kids in the school, and we get upset about it.
Now, everybody knows that there are some limits to this, but
No, there's no moral authority.
but there becomes a part where people can't really live as moral relativists to the complete end. But really, in this system, and it's built on these ideas of moral relativism, that you're going to get this inconsistency. A couple of things here. Again, where we are, the accusation against us is that we're on the wrong side of history, right? If we don't go along with what's going on in the culture, how did we get here? What's going on? Where are we? Some of the other things that aren't part of that picture but are kind of large realities. We now live in a post-Christian world. The West is post-Christian. There's a whole story behind this. It's a big feature. But a big part of the post-Christian is that God is no longer the center of things. And God's no longer the center of things. Something else is going to become the center of things. And really, you and I, me, the big me, has become the center of all things. Just so you know, there's a guy named Feuerbach who was a theologian who wrote a book called The Essence of Christianity in the 1800s. And he was the first one who made this statement that all theology is really anthropology. There is no God, and all the claims of theology are just taking humanity and putting it up on the screen of eternity, using kind of Plato's little picture of the cave. And what you and I have to come to is the place of really realizing that man is the measure of all things. And Feuerbach influenced Nietzsche. Nietzsche ended up influencing what's called critical theory. Critical theory ended up influencing what's called critical race theory. We're going to cover some of that history today. This comes from Charles Taylor. Again, where are we? We live in a post-Christian age. We also live in an age. I'm giving you the two fancy words in your notes. I'm just going to explain them for you. The first one, which begins with an M, refers to how things used to be. The world had a given order, this mimetic. The given order was typically God. We find our identity by discovering our place in the given order. I have roles, I have callings. My primary sense of identity comes as I interact with the world without, and I find my place there. We're shifting, and we really have shifted. The poietic comes from his term poiesis. The world lacks intrinsic meaning and purpose. There are no moral absolutes. There is no God. Things just are. It's by random chance. You'll hear Darwin supporting, as a support to that. If there is no intrinsic meaning to the world, I must make my own meaning. I was talking about this. One of the newest movies out is a movie called Free Guy. It's about a video game where a video game avatar discovers his own sense of personal identity. In the story of this movie, what you basically get is the core center of the emotional gist of this movie is where the two friends are talking and there is no meaning. And the one friend turns to the other and says, listen, it doesn't matter if there's no meaning out there. We're making our meaning for ourselves right here. That's the modern world. You've got to make your own meaning. It used to be that you'd find your sense of identity out there. What Charles Taylor is saying now, you find it in here. Who am I? It's not an outward search, it's an inward search. Postmodern, and the big feature of postmodernism is there are no moral absolutes. And then there's a second feature of postmodernism. Not only are there no moral absolutes, but anybody who's making a truth claim you should be suspicious of, that in some way they are trying to grab for power, and they're going to oppress you if you give them that power. Postmodernism began as a literary movement, and it came with what's called the hermeneutic of suspicion, but it now is kind of a ripple of the modern worldview. And now there's just this skepticism about all truth claims. Turning to page 3. So this is a picture formed by a sociologist named Philip Reif. Cultures are defined, and there's some features here that I want you to be aware of to think about just how we think about our culture. Cultures are defined by what they forbid. It says if you really want to know what a culture is about, look at the things that are really important to them because they forbid it. And it's one analysis, and I'll just pull it right up to contemporary today. One of the fundamentals of the American project as it began, it is the First Amendment, is freedom of speech. Today, freedom of speech is being questioned. In college campuses, it is often seen as a threat, not a value. It is something to be done away with because you can hurt my feelings with your words and you do violence to me. And those are microaggressions. We now have hate laws and hate speech laws in different countries in Western civilization. what's important to a civilization or a culture, they forbid. Why do they value that over something else? So I think it's a good observational tool. Cultures survive principally by the power of its institutions to bind and loose people in the conduct of their affairs with reasons which sink so deep into the self that they become commonly implicitly understood. We get enculturated. And the thing is that there's what cultures do that they hold together is there's certain values that are just so important that you don't even question them anymore. They just shape the way that you live. Cultures want to shape you and form you. You and I are in the midst of cultural conflict. There are competing forces that are trying to say this is the type of culture that we should have. Cultures historically have directed people outwards, except our latest one directs you inwards. And then he gives these 4 classifications to try to describe the movement that we see over time. He goes back to Greco-Roman culture and he says in Greco-Roman culture, the center of life was the polis. You belonged to a city. It gave you a sense of identity. And so it created the political man. And while there would be a whole bunch of people in the Roman Empire who may disagree that the center of their life was their ability to be involved with politics, when we think about the Roman Empire, we mostly think of their politics and the fact of the people who ruled it. We move from the political man to when Christianity became Christendom, and for more than 1,000 years, the church became the center of the culture. And Reef said, there you have the religious man. And what became central was the teachings of the church that shaped people's understanding in society. Reef was really influenced by Karl Marx, and so he wasn't so impressed with the Enlightenment. He was impressed with the Industrial Revolution. And he said the next real phase in human history was the economic man. And then finally, he said, and he was writing in the I think this was in the 1970s, maybe a little before 60s, but he said, and now we have entered the age of the psychological man. And in this now, the sense of your own personal feelings and guarding those feelings and then the therapeutic, making you feel well, has become the center of what's important. And his term is pretty much synonymous with the idea of Charles Taylor of the expressive individual. It's very much this center of emotivism, emotion, what's going on inside me, how I feel. Let's move to page 4. I gave you the same thing just twice. How did we get here? I'm going to break this down for you in a couple of just big nuggets, like chunks of ideas. How did we get here? I'm going to first pick on Hume, Darwin, and Nietzsche, and I'm going to talk about basically the practical idea that our society functions as practical atheists. Even while there has been the continued presence of the Church of Jesus Christ, even as there have been people who identify as being religious. David Hume gave one of your first really strong attacks against belief in God, period. And he gave the arguments for the rejection of the miracles. And beginning with Hume, you really begin the attack against the idea of God, and then you get people who can identify intellectually as atheists. What was really big for atheism to really take root in our society, because these things have to have some reasonable sense of plausibility, was Darwin. Because what Darwin did is he gave us a way out of positing a creator. God is not necessary to explain the origin of life. How did we get here? How we thinking beings? Well, it's just natural adaptation, small little movements over time stretched out, and the stronger survives and the lesser don't, and this is how we got here. And even as the science behind what Darwin proposed hasn't been fulfilled, the basic principles were simple enough to understand and seemed to make sense from what people could see that Darwin was accepted. Now, what happened over the course of the 1800s is that at the university level, basically atheism was taking off. Sometimes people wouldn't claim to be atheists, they'd only claim to be agnostics, but people were being influenced and the universities were slowly losing belief in God. Nietzsche started writing at the end of the 1800s, and he had a fairly short career. And what Nietzsche did was he looked at the progress, and Nietzsche's after Feuerbach, and Feuerbach says, there is no God, all theology is just anthropology. He was just expressing kind of the feeling among the intellectual elites in Western civilization. And Nietzsche came along and he said, listen, we're still functioning with Christian morality, but we don't believe in God. There is no basis for morality without God. And since we don't believe in God, we have to quit using Christian morality. Now, in the 1960s, I think it was 1963, Time magazine came out and said, God is dead. What they meant by that was in some sense of what Nietzsche was talking about, is that God is practically useless in our society as any explanatory means, and we should live life without him. Now, it took almost 60 years for them to be able to say in public what Nietzsche said at the university level. But what you had happen is that slowly the ideas in the university trickled down where it became our culture. Morality is an illusion. It has no objective basis. Now this is Nietzsche. Be whoever you want to be and do whatever works for you. Sound familiar? So this is the part where when you start to look at some of what we're experiencing in our culture, one of the roots is that. It is the loss of God, the loss of transcendence. There are some of the main figures that help move that idea and the practical consequences of those ideas into our culture today. Another person to name, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. If you look down at this, if you look down at the bottom slide, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote The Social Contract. We don't read much of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but Rousseau had a big impact on helping us towards expressive individualism. This is probably his most famous lines: man is born free and everywhere is in chains. And this is the big idea that Rousseau brought to us. Remember what Christian teaching is. You and I are sinners. We need saving. We're broken. People don't like that. It's offensive, especially if you don't want to admit to all your problems. The gospel can be offensive. Well, you have these people, and part of the reason that they're rejecting is they don't like the morality that goes along with it. Rousseau comes and he gives the opposite story of the Christian story. Man is born free. The child is innocent. The problem is the society around the child that brings all these restrictions and pressures. And if we could just get back to a natural state where we didn't have the outside things, and if we were true to what's inside of us, all would be well. Does that sound familiar? That comes from Rousseau. Humanity begins in a state of perfection, but society trips us up. What really matters is what's going on inside of you. The human is at his or her best when they act according to their nature. Which goes to anarchy, right? But according to Rousseau. Now, Rousseau, if you read him, there's some nuance to this stuff. He's still functioning out of a Christian worldview. He still makes some assumptions. This is pre-Nietzsche, but a lot of these ideas, this is non-Christian, even anti-Christian teaching. The only slave is the man who does evil, for he always does it in spite of himself. Free is found in no government. It is in the heart of the free man. It takes him everywhere. The vile man takes his servitude everywhere. When you get stuck under the strictures of society and you get bound by what they tell you to do that deny the true freedom of what you are, you're living a servitude of life. Now, question.
Humanity begins in a state of perfection and society trips him up.
Yep.
Society is other people.
Yep.
So this is.
Yep.
Yeah.
So.
How can perfect people trip each other up?
Yep. So the observation is if I'm perfect from the beginning and then society, but society is a human product, and then all of us humans were perfect, then how could these perfect human beings be tripping each other up? It's not, it doesn't make sense. It's not the best explanatory story of the world.
It's not at all.
But it's something that has influenced, and this had a lot of influence. Now, realize there's other things going on. So this is the part where if we fill this in and we start talking about living in a post-Christian world, and we start talking about, the attacks against Christendom, one of the things that we have to remember is we got to put this in historical context. The religion of the time got caught up, and I'm using the term religion on purpose as opposed to Christianity. Remember we talked about that really Christianity devolves into religion, but Christianity isn't fundamentally religion. But the religion of the time often tied itself to the powers of the state. And one of the things that was happening is that you had bishops and priests and cardinals and popes who didn't look very Jesus-like, but they had their feet on the levers of power, and people saw this. And you'd experienced 100 years war, you experienced a 30 years war, and so there was a lot where these intellectuals wanted to do away with the past, and the church was part of the oppressive past that they wanted to do away with. So, these things don't come in a vacuum, and while we could sit there and say, what about this? And now there is some nuance to this. If we read through everything, he tries to wrestle through some of it, but that's his basic premise right there. And I know of no good answer that he comes back to as saying, wait a second, if we're all perfect, then where does the imperfection come from society? But that's what he said, and it had a big influence. It has had a big influence on Western civilization. I mean, this is the part where, you still, there's a contrast as far as between Christian and non-Christian, and even how our society will look at this the way that we look at children, and that's the part where it's like, yeah, I know that my child's a sinner. I'm not, I don't think that everything they do is because of original sin, but, I know that this becomes a part where, oh, I can't believe that you're trying to, describe your child as a sinner. They're innocent. They haven't done anything. And it's just like, well, that's not my explanatory story. Phil.
Yeah, the statement "free is found in no government" rang a bell. We have a current form of thinking about government in our great America democratic experiment that the best government is the least government. The best government is the least government. I wouldn't be a proponent that the best government is the most government, but I think the reality is somewhere in between. And I think that this idea, even as expressed in modern American politics, is a real good example of just a real naive, wishful thinking. That we can get by without restriction and government.
Yeah, and an observation of a little bit of the naivete of this, and this is something, it marked the Enlightenment, an optimism about what human potential is, and that human, and this becomes a part where if we just have enough reason, and we just get enough education, everything's going to work out. And this is where postmodernism comes back as a critique, and it has a valid point in the critique. Now, One of the first real ripples to the Enlightenment is a movement that emerged in the 1800s called Romanticism. And Romanticism was really a reaction to the hyper-rationalism of the scientific aspect of the Enlightenment. And a little bit of the materialism. Now, how did we get here? Romanticism has a part to play in shaping our world today. Now, I give you 3 romantic poets, writers: Wordsworth, Shelley, Blake. One of the things just to stand out here is that from philosophy to society as a whole, the arts are a helpful ally. Romanticism was a movement of the arts. It was a movement of poets. And philosophers are not always the most convincing people in the world. Their arguments can be very persuasive, but they can be very dry and boring. One of the things to observe is that we have, part of the reason I'm telling this story to you is that all through our history, you have groups of people who want to push culture in a certain direction. The LGBTQ community wants to push culture in a certain direction. The choice of the words transphobic and homophobic are chosen very carefully. They want to control the narrative so that you have, what can you say if you admit from the get-go that you have an irrational fear? The solution is for you to no longer fear because you become rational. And if you no longer fear because you become rational, then you'll just accept this because that's what you should do. So in this, there's these movements. Part of the success of the homosexual movement is what they did in the 90s as far as starting to promote homosexuality as something normative across television. They became a cultural force after the Stonewall riots in 1968, and they finally had enough, and gay men stood up and said, we're going to fight back. But it was only when they really started to think more strategically, and they started to present homosexuality not like the Village People, but the Village People from the 70s where they're all dressed up and you've got people wearing, and you have the people in the leathers and all of this stuff. No, that's not what we want to picture. We want to picture things like Will and Grace, where it's just another nice couple. The arts are a very helpful ally of changing things. Clay.
Back in the, late 70s, down in LA, in the high schools, the kids were encouraged to have a boyfriend and a girlfriend, both. So that whether they, it was cool to have both. Well, that was sure warped. Really wrong.
Yes, Stephanie.
I'd like to also point out that the choice of using the word gay in itself is a narrative, because up until that point it had been used to describe happiness.
Right?
So,
Observation of being, very much you think through the use of the word gay. Yeah, my mom's middle name is Gay, and it just meant happy. And it was a concerted effort to try to put forward a certain lifestyle. Okay, so these poets. To find our true self, we must turn inward to personal experience, which will help us discover universal truths. We have to be true to our inner impulses. Society has parted man from man, and we are neglectful of the universal heart. That comes from Wordsworth, I believe. And there you get this picture. This was part of the Romantic movement. You've got to flee. One of the problems of modernity and of the Industrial Revolution and the things that we're seeing of all of this stuff is it's separating us from nature. It's separating you from your true self. Let's go out into nature. Let's have experiences. It was very experiential. The power of poetry is the experience of poetry. You notice today what many people value is collecting experiences. And I like experiences. They're great. Yes, I feel alive. The Romantics made those observations, but they also make them central. Romanticism is a movement of feelings over reason. What does our society value now more? It's tended to value more about feelings.
Everybody gets a trophy.
Everybody, yep, we don't want to hurt feelings. Feelings, it's who you really are. Sexual identity, again, you're not just criticizing what I do, you're rejecting me as a person. And that's aggressive, and that's violent, and that's mean. Freedom from religion and freedom for erotic love. The Romantics are beginning to bring in both, at the center of it, they had a concern of loosening the bonds of sexual morality so you can do whatever you want to do sexually. Now, contextually, this was the Victorian age. In Britain, you had a high sense of just keeping all things of sex, only have sex when you're trying to procreate, and don't.
Hide that.
And hide that. So, but they're reacting to all of this, and they're saying, let's do away with the church. It's oppressive. It's part of the authoritarian structure. And the goals were about freeing up. Now, they're laying a groundwork that's going to lead to Freud. External socially constructed constraints militate against the authenticity of the self in a manner that leads to a loss of freedom. This is very much the same idea of Rousseau. For Blake and Shelley, Christianity was the worst offender. And so with the Romantics, you not only have this affirmation of Rousseau, not only do you have this turning inward, not only do you have the attack against the structures of society, but you also get a little bit more specifically, especially because you want to go towards opening up sexual morality, you then attack Christianity all the more. How did we get here? This next one on page 5. Oh, and how are you doing? Is this good? Connecting? Any? I'm covering a lot of ground and stuff, but I'm not losing you. Oh,
Which
Miriam.
Shelley are you talking about?
Percy Walker. Wait, not Percy Walker. Percy Shelley.
Okay, because his wife, who wrote Frankenstein.
Wrote Frankenstein, yeah.
That's the story of a man who was created by man, was ugly, and was rejected because of his ugliness, in spite of the fact that he was very intelligent and very caring. And it's the same sort of thing.
And I read there's and
Well, I just read it a couple of years ago.
Yeah, so Shelley is the poet. Percy Shelley was married to Mary, what's her name, who's the author of Frankenstein.
Right.
I think she used Shelley as her middle name, but there's an interesting thing in the story of that is that they would get together. It would be her and Shelley and one of the other poets, and they would get together on holidays, and they would have writing contests and the idea. And so she took up the challenge of trying to write a horror story, and that's ultimately what became Frankenstein.
Wollstonecraft.
What was it?
Wollstonecraft. Really easily rememberable.
Yes. Okay, so when I say the plausibility of self-creation, this is very much tied to the idea of Charles Taylor and where we are today in poiesis. You can become whatever you want to be. Now, we all know at some level that there's limits to that. I was never going to make a great NBA player. I'm, maybe if I really, really worked hard, maybe, but there's, the likelihood is, and I really wasn't interested, so that's okay. But, that's the part where, it's like, our society says this, but, in practicality, but there is the sense where we will affirm that, you work at it, you can. Now, this is so different from almost all the rest of history, where you would be born into some stratus of society, and that's where you basically were. Remember I told the story in a sermon a few weeks ago of, so your last name is Smith, and you've got three choices. You can either go into the priesthood, you can go into the military, or you're going to learn the family trade and you're going to be a Smith. And your sense of identity and what you did mostly came from without. We don't live that way anymore. You can be whatever you want to be is the basic thing. And now, how do we convince people of that? There has to be some plausibility. And this is a part where Nietzsche, Marx, and Darwin all have a role of playing the plausibility that you can just basically be whoever you want to be. Now, there's a materialistic root to this. And when I say materialistic, I mean the structures of the material society around us, things were happening. We'd had a scientific revolution that led to an industrial revolution that led to a major shift from being an agrarian society to an industrial society. It meant a major move from being on the farm to being in the city. One of the things that we haven't talked about yet, and which goes to this idea of poiesis, this idea that things are plastic. Through almost all of human history, your experience of the world was, this is a big, scary place that I don't have much control over. And basically, there's some order out there, and at least I'm assuming there's an order out there, and if I believe in God, then I know that there's an order out there. But most of what happens to me is happening to me, and I don't have much control over it. And then we had the scientific revolution, and then we had the industrial revolution, and with that there was this thing of, and I'll use one of my favorite shows growing up. I think it said something like, we have the technology, the $6 Million Man. And now we can recreate things. We can do things. We don't look out at the world and think that we're victims of it. We look out at the world and say, how do we conquer it? Well, that goes a long way in increasing the plausibility that you can just be whatever you want to be. Nietzsche, what did he do towards the plausibility of self-creation? Claims to truth are not ultimately claims about objective reality, but claims about preference. This is where moral relativism comes in. Nietzsche was the father of moral relativism. His book, The Genealogy of Morals, is this whole story of the fact that, we have to move beyond all morality. They are claims of preference, just how you want to be, how you want the world to be. Now, Nietzsche, so there is no absolute truth. When people claim truth, they're just telling you their preference. When people are sitting there telling you this is what you should be, they're really just saying this is what I feel like you should be. And that doesn't mean that it's your truth. You've got to go discover it for yourself. You can be whatever you want to be. The most disgusting form of truth claims are Christian. Because it fundamentally elevates servitude and its weakness. And if you didn't know this, Nietzsche is the one who's famous that basically the way forward into the future is going to be some supermen who can use their will and dominate society and press their will on society. A natural outworking of Nietzsche's philosophy is Hitler. Hitler's out of vogue, but Nietzsche's very much in vogue. Because we like the idea that we can be whatever we want to be, and I'm going to impose my will upon the world, and I'm going to make the world into the place that I want it to be. But there is this strong anti-Christian part of Nietzsche. And you notice this through all of this stuff? So you move, and Rousseau, religion can be a problem. You move forward, the Romantics, Christianity's in the way. Nietzsche, it's the worst of all things. Freud, we're going to get there, it's just an illusion that's a neurosis, that's an implication that if you believe in this stuff, you're infantile. So very much anti-Christian. Therefore, be suspicious of all truth claims as grabs for power and the fundamental position that religion is distasteful. The big mistake of humanity is assuming that we have an assigned human nature. Freedom means being free from any sense of essential purpose and free for self-creation. So Nietzsche becomes one of those ones who points the world towards this idea that you just need to make yourself and you can be whatever you want to be. Moving forward, page 6. How am I doing on time?
10 after.
Okay. I think I got about a right amount of material. Any questions over what we're covering? Go ahead.
The problem I have is if I cobble all these people together, they try and stand for everything, so they stand for nothing.
Well, so the observation is that, we listen to this, they stand for everything, they stand for nothing. Well, I think though, there's truth to that. That's, it becomes part of our pushback against their explanatory story. But you know what Nietzsche really stood for? Is he stood for observing that there is no morality, that there is no God, there is no moral authority. You just have to make your own meaning. That's one possible explanation of things. And he was the one who kind of just was the most honest about it, actually. Because he's coming back and saying, all of the rest of you are just, you sit there and say that religion's good and religion helps keep people in check and we can use Christian morality. One of the things to know is again, it's not in a vacuum. A lot of Christian theology at this time is reacting to and even basically agreeing with much of what's being observed in what I've said. So the father of modern liberal theology is a guy named Ludwig Feuerbach. No, sorry, not Ludwig Feuerbach. Schleiermacher. Friedrich Schleiermacher. And Schleiermacher basically is trying to rescue Christianity while accepting much of the critique that the Bible isn't reliable history. And what he goes to is kind of not surprising once you think about it. He goes to the inner experience. Can't really trust anything that the Bible has to say. We really don't know much about Jesus. I get it that the miracles, but there's a feeling that you can have of something greater than you. And here's one person who's sitting there saying, the teachings of Jesus are really good, even if we can't believe in any of the miracles and stuff like that. And Nietzsche's listening to these things. He's just saying, okay, people, it's time to wake up. God's dead. That whole moral thing, its only basis is because there's a God. There is no God, so we have to live differently than what we lived before. Freud's going to take us further. So it's not the best explanatory story. There's an interesting part with Nietzsche, if you did not know this, is that he's often called the father of nihilism because there is no meaning. He ended up going crazy and ended his life in an insane asylum and died quite young, in I think his early mid-40s. And part of the pushback of all of this as we think about these forces at work is, does it work? It's not the only question, but this is the part where, This system does not lead to human flourishing at all.
There's a lot of very carefully crafted intellectual text that's quite empty.
Yes.
Empty philosophy.
The observation is there's quite a few intellectual texts, some of the most foundational philosophical documents of the last 150 years that are quite empty. And that's our story because they don't start with Christ. And if you don't start with Christ and you don't have the right foundation, everything you build is going to be fruitless. This is a story of competing worldviews. We are not passive in this. We are presenting an alternative. One of the things, though, is that here's my guess. Who's Clay, you probably know the answer to this. What group of people have probably been most influenced by transgenderism as far as an age group?
Sports. But what group?
What age group of people have been most influenced?
High school.
High schoolers.
High schoolers.
Yeah. The prevalence of transgender identity is from a percentage-wise, is somewhere probably in the 10% area, maybe more. Gender dysphoria, which was gender identity disorder, was something that used to be maybe something that maybe less than 1% of people, it was a very low number. It's becoming on the rise. We're having, I'm sure you've heard this, but we're having parents who are allowing their children to pick their genders at 5 years old. And and the medical establishment is thinking about giving hormone blockers to children going through puberty so that they can identify with the gender that they want. The government is playing the game and has just celebrated that they have a passport in that now when you mark gender, you can just have X. And so there's an agenda. There's a push for a worldview. I am sure most of these kids wouldn't know any of the names that we're talking about, or very few, and they wouldn't have any idea of what they were really promoting.
To share another little story, teaching, the very first day I had, back before it was co-ed, I had all the guys together and I said, okay guys, we're going to play a lot of games, guy games. We're building men here and we're going to play dodgeball and a lot of games. Okay, so we're going to be building some men here. Well, a young man didn't show up for 2 weeks, and I finally checked on him, and counselor called me in and says, "Well, you scared the daylights out of him. He doesn't want to be a man." I didn't know what to do with that myself, but she transferred him out. But that's something that at one time it wasn't known, it was hidden. Everybody kept that like it was a disease or something, but now it's accepted.
When was that?
Huh?
When was that? What?
But I would say about 86, 1986.
You'd get in trouble if you did it now.
For me saying that.
Yeah, I mean, a teacher would get in trouble saying that probably nowadays.
Yeah, I really saw things change when I don't mean to be judging or anything, but when we went from co-ed physical education or from individual to co-ed, the guys didn't want to show off in front of the girls, so they got real passive, but the girls got very aggressive. And I really saw that because, they didn't want to hurt the girls, they didn't want to show off, it was all about image, and so on and so forth. And the girls kept getting better and better and better, and the guys kept getting softer. I mean, that's my opinion, but other PE teachers would say the same thing.
Well, and this is one of the things to think about, because we're talking about just the impact that this has on teenagers, is as we come and understand that expressive individualism is the way that our society functions, that it puts all this pressure on you and you discovering who you are. And that discovery is going to be from within, but it's not really fully within. It's so much shaped by the culture from without. But, you know, it becomes the interplay, and it's about what you feel. There is now this incredible pressure on all of us about, well, am I winning? Am I successful? Who am I? How do I answer this question? And I would hate to answer this question in a way that makes me feel bad. And kids are getting all of this at a hyper level. Okay, so let's see. I am on page 5, turning over to page 6. I will talk a little bit more about. I'll talk about Marx and Darwin again next week. Let me move forward, because I want to come to this section. Okay, so basically you're getting this movement that the Romantics push you this way, other philosophers help. You want to become whoever you are. Why sex is the answer, Sigmund Freud. Now Freud comes into this, and what he ends up saying is that your identity and what you need to discover and the way to true happiness is going to be through sex. Now you know why we're going to focus on Freud in this, is because part of this is the roots of the sexual revolution. And this attitude where sex becomes the main thing is Freud. This is what he brings to the table. From the Romantics, we are told that happiness is really about an inner psychological state. For Freud, happiness needs to be focused more precisely. Happiness is sexual pleasure. This is a quote from his book, Civilization and Its Discontents. Man's discovery that sexual love afforded him the strongest experience of satisfaction, in fact, provided him the prototype of all happiness, must have suggested to him that he should continue to seek the satisfaction of happiness in life along the path of sexual relations, and that he should make genital eroticism the central point of his life. Genital. You having an orgasm. This becomes the part where, like you say something like this and you go, are you really serious? Is that really what he said? And the answer is yes, that's really what he said. That's really what he was about. Rousseau saw unhappiness as the result of the corrupting powers of civilized society. And his critique was this: civilized society moralized self-love, gave you restrictions on how you were to love yourself, which prevented people from being true to themselves and forcing them to follow artificial conventions. Freud stands in congruity with Rousseau, but he sexualizes it and darkens it. The problem is that we have natural sexual desires that will lead us to be happy, and civilized society restricts us from fulfilling those desires. Further, the natural man is dark, violent, and irrational. And so Freud gets into this and he says, so man made this discovery. Woohoo! That felt really, really good. This is the ultimate form of happiness. I must pursue this. But Freud, I guess being a realist, sat there and said, well, all you have to do is look out in nature, and there's a few people who are really strong and they end up dominating. And then those strong people end up frustrating everybody else because they take everything for themselves and they leave people with less. So, in order for us to negotiate that, we created civilization so that the strong couldn't dominate and we could all of us experience a little bit. And so we compromised. And instead of being able to indulge fully, because some of us wouldn't be strong enough in this broken, bad world with dark desires, well, we allow for civilizations to exist, but those civilizations are still getting in the way. Thus, we gave up our happiness for security. We forfeited true happiness, free sexual expression, so that we could be safe. Now, Freud brings this idea, and he says what is most essential about you being human is you as a sexual being. Now, one of the challenges to that idea is, well, what are kids? Because kids aren't really sexual beings yet. They haven't gone through puberty. So if it's really the very central thing of being human, it seems kind of inconsistent that it's not something that you experience throughout your whole humanity, right? That would be a comeback. So what Freud ended up doing was he made it plausible that sexuality is something that children are. Children become sexual beings, the sexualization of children. Central to this becomes a discussion about masturbation. Interesting thing with the story of masturbation. Underneath the teachings of Christianity, it was seen as a sin. And it was something that was dissuaded. There were some stories as far as also some of the consequences. But in the 1800s, you began to move away from Christianity as an explanatory thing. So what do you do about masturbation? Now, you still had basic Christian morals, and so you didn't look at it as a religious moral issue. You looked at it as a health issue. And medical doctors would sit there and they would give warnings about some of the potential health hazards of masturbation. Well, finally, some people actually did some scientific research on it, and I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but he concluded that there is no medical problem with children masturbating. Freud picked up that person's study, brought it into his own explanation, and he sat there and he said, this is just part of natural development. And in the early stage, children identify themselves as sexual beings, and this becomes a part where you first talk about oral fixation. And he's talking about that in sexual terms and some of that stuff. Now, if you didn't know this, almost all of Freud's basic ideas about how you approach psychoanalysis and psychotherapy today is dismissed as pretty much rubbish. You read him for history. You don't read him to learn how to be a good therapist. But you want to know the one impact that he has, and it's a lasting impact, it's the influence of sex. Okay, so you have heard that there are pushes in our society to teach children in our school systems, in elementary school, about how to properly do masturbation. I hear that, I'm just like, what? You've heard the stories, I'm sure you have, of the parents going to the school board meeting saying, I found this sexually explicit material in my children's elementary school. Let's have drag queens read stories to children. Let's dress up little children as adults and sexualize them. All of this stuff is happening in our culture, and it finds its intellectual roots with Freud. What Freud ends up doing is he ends up tying sex to identity. And so when we get to this idea of expressive individualism in our society today, expressive individualism takes a very specific form influenced by Freud, that much of it is experienced as us as sexual beings. Basically, a lot of our society has, in practice, just fundamentally adopted the approach that Freud took, that, yeah, it feels really good and this is what my life should be about, and so I'm going to pursue this. Guess what? We're not done. I've got a couple of more things from history, but we are done for time tonight, and I probably covered more than enough. Anything as far as taking away tonight that there's a question or comments that I could, come back with or need to clarify or anything like that?
Have any good news for us tonight?
Do I have any good news for us tonight?
You're sitting with people who love you.
There you go.
Oh, gosh.
What I found, here's some good news, I think. I think it's helped me to be more empathetic. I mean, in the sense of sitting there, you know, I look at these things and I sit there and I slap my head and I'm like, just how? And I don't do that as much anymore. I sit there and I go, oh, it goes back here and here and here. And you know, and in that sense, instead of being reactionary, I think that we can have a larger understanding of these forces at play. And I think it'll better position us to listen. I mean, that's the part where I'm like, you know, we had a person who identified as transgender who was worshiping with us for a few years. And, you know, they weren't a Christian. They didn't identify as a Christian, but they were coming because they wanted to learn about Jesus. And, you know, and what was interesting in all of that is that, you know, I wanted to witness to this person, and I was willing to go wherever the person was willing to go in conversation. And, you know, and the person went through the transition stuff, but they didn't want any input. Because when I found out about it and they'd asked for prayer, I didn't know what kind of prayer they were looking for. So I went and I pursued. So you want prayer. What does this, you know, like, how can I pray for you? And I pushed. So as you've been going through this, have you really even considered what Jesus is calling you to do? Nope. Not interested in that. Okay. You know, and so that becomes a part where it's just like, I'm pretty sure that person doesn't have a big idea about a lot of the forces that just, you know, this is the part where the individual. And so you got to distinguish between the individual and the movements. And with these movements, you know, and the forces that are at play, I mean, part of it, I think the beginning becomes understanding, and then now what do we do? And this is the part where I think the more of us who can be in dialogue, we can pray, but we can also, you know, these are the major forces of our society that are the secular age, the part of our world that's against God. And, but, you know, in the end, I don't think it's the best explanatory story of the world. I think it has a bunch of holes. I think it leads to chaos and anarchy. I think we're seeing a lot of that stuff. And, you know, and to be able to ask the right questions, to understand the inconsistencies. I mean, it's the observation of going, why is sex so important in our society? I mean, it's really not that big of a deal, you know, as far as the actual, and it's like, why do we say sex? What are we talking about? The sexual act? Are we talking about gender? You know, why don't we say lovemaking anymore? I'll tell you why we don't say lovemaking anymore, because we've divorced the act from its fundamental purpose, which was to bond together the husband and the wife, and we've dismissed marriage. And doing that isn't a recipe for happiness that actually is going to make you less happy. We believe that. We know that to be true. We have to witness that.
So the cry is, so what does love have to do with it?
Right. It's just biology. I mean, that's the attitude of younger people today, is it's not really about love at all. It's just a biological function that makes me feel good. Really? And really, it doesn't work. Because we know that it's a spiritual thing, and it has a bonding thing, and every time that you make love, it's like sticking masking tape, you know, or duct tape on your arm, and then every time you pull it off, and it hurts, and people get hurt. And you know, anyways, yes, Miriam.
I have a relative that I, don't want to identify so you don't figure out. She doesn't understand why, when she screws her friends' boyfriends, her friends get mad at her. That's...
Yeah. So much, this is, and yeah. Well, let me pray for us. Lord, it is tragic to see the world separated from you. And you can have very smart people who end up making very foolish choices. Lord, help us to understand, to love, to know, to be able to discern the good, to be able to affirm your truth, and help us to be able to, when you give us the opportunity to shine your light and your love for people. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you.
Thanks.